Fantastic. All right. Thanks everyone for having me along. My name's Sophie. I'm a web developer at Monzo Bank in London, and I'm going to talk to you about the skills that I learned during my time as an English teacher that have actually made me a better developer. So, as I said, I'm a senior web engineer at Monzo Bank, based in the UK, and I lead the web discipline there along with my colleague Dylan. And I also lead our choir, which unfortunately hasn't been able to meet for quite a long time because of obviously everything that's going on this year. And as developers, it's vital that we have good communication skills. It's not enough to just put our heads down and write code all day. And we need to be able to deal with stakeholders, with clients, with team members. We need to be able to get new joiners up to speed and communicate how the project is going to tech leads and product managers. We need to be able to write a JIRA ticket that actually makes sense. And we need to be able to explain why something's gone wrong and what we're going to do to fix it to someone who has never actually touched a line of code. So the skills that I learned as a teacher set me up to be able to communicate well and command a room. And while that classroom management side of things is probably a bit more useful when I'm running a choir, the other skills that I learned are really valuable. And I'm going to teach you some of those in this talk. So once I started a full-time job in tech, I was actually amazed at how transferable my teaching skills were. So in the before times, when events in real life were still a thing, I used to do a lot of mentoring with kids and adults learning to code, and those skills came in really useful. And further down the line now in my job, I'm mentoring junior developers on my team, and I'm writing documentation for my whole organization. And once again, I'm putting those teaching skills to really good use. So my background, I studied linguistics at university in Manchester in the north of England, and I graduated in 2013 with no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I ended up training as an English teacher and teaching English as a foreign language until I eventually started a master's in computer science and became a developer. Now, the two areas of software development that I'm going to focus on in this talk are mentoring others and writing documentation. So not the hands-on super technical side of software development. It seems like you've had plenty of that today, but the vital and often overlooked parts of being a well-rounded developer. And they're often known as soft skills, which I really don't like because I think they're really important. And the word soft, unfortunately, does tend to have a negative connotation or be kind of dismissed as something feminine. But we might have to mentor others as a tech lead or onboard a new hire, teach your kid to code, or in my case, I had to show my mum how to edit Markdown so that she didn't keep asking me to make changes on her website. And we write documentation when we hand over a project or when we build a tool or a piece of software for public consumption, or when we want to educate people about something. So let's take a look about what we can learn from teaching when it comes to mentoring other people. Now, I'm using the word mentoring quite generally here. It doesn't have to be a formal arrangement like a workshop where people learn to code. It could be onboarding someone new into the team. It could be taking a more junior developer under your wing to help them learn the skills they need to progress. And it's challenging, I mean, you need to get the knowledge out of your brain into someone else's, and it's not necessarily as simple as just telling them stuff. When you think about what we do and everything that's involved with building websites and applications and software, it can be really overwhelming for mentors to even know where to start, let alone those people that they're teaching. So it's really important for you to let your mentee guide you. It's a two-way relationship, and you need to know why your mentee is there in the first place. So for my English students, there were a few reasons why they would be having lessons. And I'm sure many of you here today have also had English lessons, and you would have had your own reasons too. So some of them wanted to become fluent. Some of them needed to take IELTS, it's an English language qualification that helps you get into university or get a job. Some were just looking to improve their conversational English so they could get around on holiday. And these goals influence the kind of thing they need to learn, as well as their approach to learning, and often even their enthusiasm for the course. So just like my English students, the mentees in our industry have goals. Why are they learning to code? Why have you been asked to mentor them? And in our world, it's not as simple as fluency or conversational JavaScript, but there could be any number of reasons, and it's really important that you know what those are from the beginning. And it might be obvious and you don't need to explicitly discuss it. So, for example, if you're onboarding someone into the team, I mean, you know why they're there. But in a more formal relationship, such as with a junior developer, you should discuss their learning goals and identify the areas that they want to improve. And just as I wouldn't teach someone learning conversational English how to write an academic essay, you don't want to confuse someone who wants to just build a simple static web page by teaching them bubble sort or service workers. Knowing what their goals are going to help you narrow down the things you're going to teach them. And you don't need to write an entire lesson plan or structure some kind of curriculum, but it does help you make a list of the things that you think you should cover. And as well as knowing what the end goal of the learner is, it really also helps to learn how they learn best. And so that's like what techniques are most effective when they're learning something new. So if you look at the different resources available to a learner and find out from them which one is the most effective. And students actually tend to learn better from a variety of different media rather than all the same. So think back to when you last learned a language. There would have been reading exercises, conversation in pairs, listening exercises, and probably even songs. And in the classroom setting, you can't cater for individual needs and learning styles, but you can provide a wide variety of resources so that everyone's needs are met. And when it comes to developers, some read a lot of books and blog posts, others will prefer videos and diagrams, others want to get a bit more stuck in, so coding, maybe mapping things out on the whiteboard, and some people will mix and match. So for myself, I like to get stuck in. I'm quite hands-on, so I learn best by doing, but I also do read a lot of technical blog posts. But when it comes to kind of books about programming and videos, I do tend to find those less engaging. So ask your learner what their preferred methods are, and maybe you can point them in the direction of some resources that will help them. So maybe they'd benefit from watching a video or a conference talk before tackling any code, or maybe you just want to give them some smaller JIRA tickets so they can just get stuck in and ask you if they need help. And if you're leading a workshop or teaching a group, you'll want to mix and match some of these things so that you can kind of accommodate everyone in the group. So a lot of your sessions are likely to be very hands-on coding time, but you might add some kind of time of mentors pairing with students or getting students to demonstrate what they've done and explain how they've done it. So many students actually benefit from teaching things themselves. It can be a great way of consolidating what you've learned. And you can provide some resources for further reading on the topics that you're teaching that students can look at afterwards. I mean, okay, yeah, most of them probably won't read them, but some of them will. And do make sure that you, again, include a variety of different formats, so like videos and blog posts and books. And if you're recording a tutorial, it's important to provide a transcript so that people who prefer to read can get the information that you're giving them in a way that suits them. So something that springs to mind for me is something like front-end masters and courses like that often have transcripts that you can follow through. And sometimes I actually skip the video altogether and just read the transcript. And it's also a good thing from accessibility point of view for people who have difficulties watching video or listening to audio as well. They can follow along with the transcript. So when it comes to learning a language, we talk about two sets of core skills: the speaking and listening, and reading and writing. So human languages tend to have spoken and written forms, and the skills are divided into the productive skills, that's speaking and writing, and the receptive skills, so listening and reading. Now, okay, the speaking and listening part doesn't really apply to programming particularly well, but reading and writing definitely apply. And we think about being a developer in terms of writing code, but part of being a good developer is being able to read code that someone else has written and understand what it's doing. And it obviously depends on how ridiculous the code is in the first place. So remember that clean code will only get you so far if no one can actually understand it. But the same goes for English. I once had to reject a job application from someone who'd kind of put so much work into making sure that it sounded impressive with all these long words that actually I couldn't understand what they were saying. And in the English classroom, we'd work on these skills separately from learning the fundamentals of grammar and vocabulary, but it's all linked, and these skills put those grammar and vocab learnings into practice and reinforce it. And so with programming languages, obviously there's a lot less of this to pin down before you start writing code, but the more code you write, the more you get to grips with the terminology and constructs within a language. So if you're teaching someone to speak English, you're not going to sit them down right at the start and ask them to write an essay. You give them short exercises to do, so some sentences, a paragraph, and then maybe a page once they've got the confidence. You don't ask them to get up in front of the class and recite Shakespeare until they can produce simple sentences confidently. So with a programmer who's looking to build up their skills and take on more advanced work, it's exactly the same. So as a senior developer and a tech lead, I need to make sure that more junior developers have the opportunities that they need to level up and get those skills that they want to improve. So the first thing I do is ask them what those skills actually are and make sure that I know what they are. And then have a look through the tickets that we've got prioritized and see if there's anything that would suit them. We're looking for the right amount of stretch for them to really build on those skills without completely overwhelming them, which can be quite challenging. And make sure they know that you're around to help them if they get stuck. And if they are taking a really long time, then it's okay to intervene. Especially if it's affecting the team's progress. Don't let them struggle on their own either. But for real newcomers to programming, there's short exercises that are often called kata, which are really helpful. And these introduce you to basic concepts one at a time, allowing you to put them into practice before you move on. And now English students can learn a list of vocabulary, but it's actually pretty meaningless until you know how to use it in a sentence, and until you've actually produced that sentence yourself. And it's the same for code as well. I mean, you can learn what an if statement is, but it's kind of meaningless until you've actually written one and seen it in action. Arguably, one of the best ways to build skills as a developer is pair programming, which is a hands-on activity, but is much better for sharing context and getting developers more used to kind of idiomatic programming, the way that you do things in your organization. And I've worked on teams where we've paired on everything as a matter of course, and I've worked on teams where we paired occasionally when we're stuck and mostly work solo. Personally, I prefer the latter. I prefer kind of, doing my own thing and pairing when I need to. But for bringing a new team member or junior developer up to speed, it really is invaluable. So you could pair program by taking turns to write a test and make it pass, or you might time the turns to make sure everyone gets a fair go. To get the most out of pairing, there are some key things to bear in mind. And I could apply many of these to one-on-one conversation practice with students as well. So when your mentee has control of the keyboard, or as we often call it, driving, encourage them to explain what they're doing. So they don't need to narrate everything they're doing, but this will help you to understand whether they're on the right track, as well as helping them to cement their own knowledge as well. And make sure you know exactly what it is that they want feedback on so that you can pay extra attention to it as well. Let them make mistakes. Now, this is really important. It can be tempting if you see that they're writing something and you think, oh, that's going to throw an error, that you tell them before they do it. But actually, don't correct the code until that error shows up. The compiler or the output will tell them what's wrong, and let them try and debug it before you intervene. So you can always point them in the right direction, tell them how to debug it. But try not to tell them exactly what's wrong unless they ask you. So imagine you were telling a story in a foreign language and your teacher kept interrupting you to correct you. It would completely put you off. So don't interrupt the flow until, you really need to help them out. We all have house styles and preferred ways of doing things, but certainly don't sit there and nitpick their code because it'll be really off-putting. So, if the imports are in the wrong order, or we prefer const instead of let or something like that in JavaScript, if it works, then it's fine. And then afterwards, you can always go through it together and say, okay, this works, this is great. But actually, in this company, this is how we tend to write code. You can go through it afterwards and look at ways of improving and refactoring it. And if you can, get them to pair with other developers on the team as well. And this will give them a different point of view. They'll learn how others do it. And you might even learn something next time you pair with them as well. So when it's your turn to drive, make sure you act natural. Now, when teaching English students, I couldn't talk away at my normal pace to the beginner and intermediate students because they wouldn't understand what I was saying. And the same goes for me as well. So I speak okay Spanish, but I really struggle to understand normal conversational Spanish as it seems really fast to me. So just like that, when you've got the keyboard in your pairing, take care not to go too fast unless it's clear that the other person can keep up. And if you're a super speedy programmer whose brain can't keep up with your fingers, you will need to pace yourself a bit. But on the other hand, you shouldn't go too slowly. So we were also taught in teacher training not to speak super slowly like this because it's just not natural and it doesn't help students to understand English in the real world. And coding really slowly on purpose will be frustrating for the person that you're pairing with, and it'll also seem really patronizing. So ask for feedback about how they're finding the pace, and it'll help you to pace yourself effectively. And also, when you're writing code, try to explain what you're doing. Again, you don't have to narrate every single thing you're doing, but sitting in silence as someone else writes code is really boring. And it'll help your pair understand why you're doing what you're doing. And finally, don't keep all the hard problems to yourself. Even if it seems like you're doing them a favor by leaving them the easy things, if you end up with a tricky bit of syntax or a hard problem to solve, let them drive and let them work through it, because they will learn more that way. Now, eliciting is a great technique that we use a lot in the English classroom to get students interacting in the lesson. Technically, it's a range of techniques, but it involves anything that gets the learner to provide information rather than the teacher just telling them. So it wasn't just to make sure they were still listening, although it did help. It's a way of activating the knowledge that students already have, as well as helping them discover things that they themselves that makes them more likely to remember it. And it's also really helpful for the teacher to find out what students already know and what they might need more help with. So in the classroom setting, we might elicit sentences from students by drawing pictures on the board and asking them questions about it, or asking for examples of things that we're talking about or new vocabulary that we've learned. With younger groups, it's often better to nominate students to answer the questions rather than asking, does anyone know? Because often this can result in complete silence or the same people, the really eager people, answering the same questions over and over. But with adults, they do tend to be a bit more willing to share, and you can just get people to shout out the answer, although it does depend on the group. So, for example, if we learned the word, or if we've been learning the word author the previous week, we might ask the next week, what did we call someone who writes books? Or we might have a picture and ask them to identify what they're doing. Or then maybe after doing a listening exercise, asking students, what did the first person order? So we can actually use this technique when mentoring developers as well. For example, when we're pairing, asking strategic questions to help your pair debug a particularly difficult error, or maybe find a bit of syntax that they can't remember. And I found this technique worked especially well with mentoring kids. So, for example, in sessions where they were building a web page according to some instructions on a worksheet, it actually engaged them a lot more when they were able to think creatively about what they could do. So we could point to the heading and say, how would we make this a different color? Can you see where we're saying what color it should be? What happens if, how could we make it purple? And, you know, with a bit of help from us, they could make it a different color, and it would excite them. And then, you know, helping them put pictures up on the website, especially showing them how to find their own pictures, which for some reason always seemed to be Minecraft. But they got so excited when they realized they could put any image on their website. Now, eliciting works best in more formal mentoring contexts like coding workshops or pairing with a more junior developer. You can imagine in a one-to-one meeting, your mentee might start thinking you're being a bit weird if you start asking them a load of questions like this. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend using this technique with an experienced developer you're onboarding because it might come across a bit patronizing. But if the person that you're talking to is there to learn something new and you're trying to establish what they already know, and help them commit stuff to long-term memory, it can be a really good help. But do use it sparingly, so don't ask questions constantly. It is unnatural, it can distract the mentee, or it can make them frustrated if they just want to learn something. And if they don't know the answer, move on or ask someone else. Don't keep asking them. And in workshop settings, you can ask a question now and then to kind of assess attendees' prior knowledge or to consolidate something you've just taught. But when you're pairing, too many questions from you can disrupt the focus on the code, so do keep it light. Now, it's also important to choose your questions wisely, so be careful how you ask them. It does help to ask questions that are a little open, so they're not necessarily a yes/no question. Students are actually more likely to answer if they feel like they're not going to be wrong. And that's obviously in English, it's easier where there's about 5 ways of saying everything. But you could arguably say the same thing about JavaScript these days. And if they do get the answer wrong, rather than saying no, or that's not right, or something like that, you know, you be encouraging. Say something like, not quite, almost, very close. I can see why you thought that, you know. And if necessary, give them a refresher if people really don't remember the answer. Now, the teaching skills that I learned also helped me massively with the documentation I've written in my career. And I love documentation, so this is a really fun topic for me. And this has ranged for everything from readmes to full-on tutorials and even the odd lengthy Slack post about announcing something new as well. Documentation is often seen as a chore, and it can even be skipped entirely. But the power of good documentation really shouldn't be underestimated. Good documentation can be the difference between someone getting their work done efficiently or having to stop all the time to find someone to answer their questions. So as I mentioned, documentation can take many forms. So the readmes and the docs for the software that we build, they could be on the repo alongside the code in Java doc format, or they could be hosted separately as well. Or we might write tutorials and blog posts to share knowledge with others. And of course, there's conference talks and meetup talks, just like this one. It's not necessarily a written medium, but it is still a form of documentation, so the same rules apply. Now I'm going to illustrate the examples in this section with bits from Web 101, which is a self-guided tutorial I put together at Monzo. We're only a small team of web engineers, so much of the web work in our internal tooling is actually done by back-end engineers and sponsoring teams. And not all of them are super familiar with the way that we do web at Monzo, so we needed something to teach them best practices and the basics of things like accessibility and testing. And I also wanted to create an onboarding document for new web engineers as well. So Web 101 was born to cover both of those bases, and it's been really well received. And I think a lot of that is down to the way that it was written. And just like with mentoring, our first step is to identify who that learner is. So in this case, it's the consumer of our documentation. Are they complete beginners to programming? Are they experienced developers looking for the query parameters for a particular API call? Or like with Web 101, are they back-end engineers who are doing some web work? And sometimes you'll have a real mix. So the challenge is writing documentation that suits everyone's needs. And in the world of teaching, teachers will assign work for the level of the majority of the class and have stretch exercises for the more advanced students once they've finished the work. So we can apply this to the technical documentation that we write as well. And less experienced engineers will then be able to learn at a level that suits them, and more experienced engineers can quite happily skim over the stuff that they already know. And with Web 101, we broke everything up into sections so that a developer starting from the beginning could work all the way through, but then someone with a bit more context could pick and choose the sections that were most applicable to them. And the advantage of this is it's also really easy to link to specific sections from other documentation. So for example, we've got the section on developer environment setup linked from various readmes in our repos as well. So here's an example of where we provide an opportunity for users to skip sections they don't need. So in a section on the basics of GraphQL, we've got a link to actually skip to the tutorial work if they don't need to provide the primer on what GraphQL actually is. Now, register is not a term that we hear very often in terms of language. So most native speakers probably wouldn't actually know what this means in the context of English. It means a variety of language used for a particular purpose or situation. So for example, I would use a more simplified version of English when talking to my class, whereas where I'm giving a conference talk, I use words like whereas. And sometimes it's less conscious. For example, you might use more slang with your friends or peers than with your managers without even thinking about it. And that's the register of our language. So when it comes to written language, especially in a business context, we do tend to talk about tone of voice in business. And this is basically the register of your writing. So how you say what you're saying. And at Monzo, we've got a very distinctive, friendly tone of voice, which is aimed at making sure that all our customers can understand things like the terms and conditions of our accounts and weird banking terms. There's loads of weird banking terms. And our tone of voice was drafted by our amazing head of writing called Harry Ashbridge. And the article has some great tips for keeping your writing simple and clear. And it's available on our website, actually. If you go to monzo.com, it's in the footer. Now, the world of programming is absolutely enormous. I mean, I'm in Lahore right now, so people might be reading your documentation from all over the world with different levels of English, and writing in a clear, concise, and informal manner will mean that everyone can understand what you're saying. And it's also a win from an accessibility point of view as well, because people with reading and comprehension difficulties will find it a lot easier to read. When we're teaching English students, we had to be really careful not to assume that they already knew stuff, especially things that were tied to local culture. So slang words that we use without even thinking, which might seem obvious to us, but actually might make zero sense to the learner. This can end up with a student feeling quite disheartened. So we actually taught them slang as a formal lesson because they'd need it in everyday language, but we used much more common terms when we were communicating in lessons. And with documentation, assuming too much prior knowledge can actually have the same effect. And you need to make sure that your reader has enough context and understanding for your documentation to make sense to them. If you don't want to spend that time explaining the background knowledge that is needed, you can put in a section at the beginning outlining what kind of required background there is and add some links for the users to find out more. And in Web 101, we take users, engineers, through creating a new view on our internal customer service system called BizOps. And we made sure to add a background on what BizOps actually is and how it's used before getting into the code. And we've also added explanations for various concepts, so for whoever needs them, but as call-outs rather than in the body text of the tutorial, so that it's easy to skip over them if you don't need it. So for example, when we're guiding the reader through adding a GraphQL query, we explain what hooks are in a call-out before we go into the details of Apollo's use query hook. I'd really recommend getting a less experienced developer than you to read through your documentation to identify anything they don't have context on, and then you can expand on things where you need to. A great game we used to play with our English students was called Articulate, and this is where you're given a word and you have to explain what it means to your team without actually using that word. And it's a brilliant way for students to practice both their vocabulary and explaining things. Now, description skills are really useful in foreign languages when you can't remember the actual words you want to say. I'm pretty sure I once bought some tissues in a pharmacy in Spain by asking for the small papers for my nose. And it's something that we had to do as teachers as well. I mean, if a student asks us what a word means, we can't then go and use that word to explain it. And we have to explain its meaning in words that the student can understand. So being able to describe technical concepts in simple terms is such a useful skill. I can't stress that enough. A clear explanation can be the difference between someone sitting and banging their head against the desk and feeling really stupid, and that light bulb going off in their head and everything becoming clear. And some concepts are easier to explain than others, but a good explanation can really transform your documentation. If you want to practice your skills explaining technical concepts, you could put together a list of words and have your own game of programming Articulate. And it might sound very silly, but it is really good practice for being better communicators. So those non-technical people in your team will be really glad for it when you can explain exactly what you're working on in non-technical terms. And in Web 101, we could assume a base level of programming knowledge, but things like GraphQL wouldn't be familiar to everyone, so we had to explain it to them. And so the tutorial centers around donuts and writing a front-end view to manage donut purchases. So we're using this to illustrate what a schema looks like, and we explain exactly what queries and mutations are, what the various constructs in the schema do. Significant words are bolded, and explanations are simple, they're not too wordy. Another great way to explain technical concepts simply is to use real-world analogies. We'd use this in the English classroom too, for example, for the English words that our students didn't understand. So we'd use real-world concepts and stories to model those meanings. So, for example, you might describe embarrassed by describing a series of really embarrassing events that, as if they'd happened to you, and saying, "Oh, I felt so embarrassed." A few years ago, I worked on a team where I was implementing an OAuth-style authentication flow with refresh tokens, and our product manager wanted to know what it involved, and she had no background in tech. So I ended up illustrating it with this ridiculous analogy involving a secret clubhouse where you say a password to get in, and then there's a secret handshake, which is the access token, that changes, that you need to speak to everyone. And then the handshake changes every 5 minutes, and you're given a special badge, which is a refresh token, that you need to show when you want to learn the new handshake. And then when you leave the clubhouse, they take that badge off you and you get a new one next time you come in. It was really silly, but it did get the message across. So that's another exercise that you could do with your friends and colleagues to try and come up with some ridiculous analogies for some technical concepts. I challenge you to come up with a good analogy for something like Kubernetes or something, and see if they work on your non-technical friends and family as well. Now, I spoke before about the importance of knowing your learner, so understanding their goals and intentions, and what you teach them should be relevant for their goals. Now, READMEs and tutorials are a bit easier for this because you do know who's going to be reading them. But for a blog post, you can imagine who your target audience might be and write for them. But presenting facts to the reader is only going to get you so far. Now, I would teach my students all sorts, so letter writing, describing injuries, and we even had a lesson on swear words once, or the ways that the F word can be used in English. The thing is, if the students don't know why they're learning this, it's not going to be nearly as effective. So you learn how to write letters so that you can write a cover letter for a job or sort out a visa. You might need to make a doctor's appointment when you're working abroad or have a medical emergency. And living in a foreign country, you're going to hear people swearing, so you should at least know what they're talking about. Now, with documentation, explaining why will help the reader understand what they're doing. So why do we need these environment variables? Or why should we not give an onClick attribute to a div element? So giving that additional context will make things seem clearer to the reader and make it seem less like magic. In Web 101, we made sure to explain things like why we have to run a build script when supposedly browsers already understand JavaScript, or why we should be using semantic HTML elements. And it gives that extra bit of clarity, and especially with semantic HTML, it makes the reader more likely to actually do it in the end. Imagine learning a new language, so whether that's a human or a programming language, and trying to get your head around a difficult concept. Look at these sentences, examples of what we call modal verbs, and imagine trying to get your head around this. I'm sure many of you have had to get your head around this. And it usually messes with people's brains when I show this to native speakers because they just think, how did I ever learn this? Some people find grammar a lot easier than others. I've always been more of a grammar person than a vocabulary person, for example. And in one Spanish class I took, I was struggling with understanding something and I said it was difficult. And he said, no, it's easy. And it was horrible. It made me feel like I was really stupid and I didn't learn anything. And now imagine looking through the docs for a library that you're using and being presented with this sentence. It's easy. Simply synthesize a circuit, then just get to the VGA center through the online HTTP address. I mean, it makes literally no sense. And that is because it is nonsense. But for someone reading a technical document about something they're not familiar with, what you've written might seem like this too. And what seems simple to you won't be simple to everyone. So we don't use the words simply or just or basically or anything like that in Web 101. All it does is make people feel bad about their own abilities if it doesn't seem simple to them. So we got some great feedback on Web 101, largely down to that consistent, clear writing style, the background information, and the thorough explanations that we wrote. It was really great. So I've given you a lot of things to think about in this talk. And if you want to put any of them to the test, there are some things you could try. You could look for a workshop or meetup in your local area or online at the moment is more likely. Find a junior developer in your company who wants to learn something new. Offer to onboard a new starter. If you want to start getting involved in documentation, you could contribute to open source on GitHub. It is Hacktoberfest as well, so a great time to do that. Start your own blog. Blogs are cool now, again, which I absolutely love. And you could try writing for dev.to as well, which is a really nice platform for developers sharing documentation. Thank you so much for having me. I have Twitter. I'll be around to answer any questions afterwards as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sophie. That was a very insightful session. I think we have a couple of questions. Let me just see.
Yeah, I can take over.
Sure.
Okay, so our first question is, if a junior web developer is stuck on a particular problem, how long should he or she wait to ask a senior for help?
So I always think that, I'm still sharing my screen. Shoot. I still think that if you're a junior developer, you definitely should spend some time to try and work out yourself, right? So, I mean, everyone knows that Googling is an engineer's secret weapon. And so it's a bad sign if you don't look anything up yourself effectively. But it is also a worse sign if you don't ask any questions. So I guess my tips to junior developers would be to ask questions first to make sure that you understand the problem, then go away and try and do your research. And then if you can't find the answer, then you can go back and ask for more help. But make sure that you actually understand the problem first before you're going away to and doing your research. But then if you're a senior developer working with a junior developer who is doing that research, I guess if they're kind of not giving you progress updates and you're not sure how they're getting on, you can check in on them. And if it's obvious they haven't got very far, then it might be time to intervene.
Makes sense. The second question we have is, what is the right balance of formal and informal interaction between mentees? How to look for mentors for junior developers as a freelancer?
So formal and informal. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So most of the mentoring arrangements that I've had have actually been quite informal. I have a mentor at work at the moment, and we just met once over lunch, and we just meet once a month to have a chat about anything. And I tend to ask questions like, how did you get to where you are? Like, what would you do differently? Or ask about like challenges that they faced in their career. So, and then it kind of becomes a formal relationship over time. But I think, there's different kinds of mentoring relationships. So when I talk about more formal context, I guess I'm talking about the workshops that you might go to, or being assigned a junior developer to look after at work. Whereas otherwise, the more informal ones would just be, meeting for coffee occasionally and having a chat. As for like finding them, so I obviously can't claim to be an expert about what's going on in your local area. So we've got some organisations around the UK called there's one called Coder Dojo, which I think is in the US as well, which is a kids mentoring, kids coding workshop. There's also Code Bar, which is international, and there's new ones popping up all over the world all the time. And that's where you can go as a mentor or a coach or a student, and then you get paired up with someone who does the same language as you to help with a project. And those are online at the moment, so I don't see why people from all over the world couldn't get involved in those as well.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you again, Sophie.